Welcome back to our exploration of the book of First Enoch and Enochic literature in general. In this session, we're going to be tackling, as the title suggests, the rebellion of the Watchers, and predominantly most of the material in the Book of Watchers, which sort of covers a large swath of the early chapters of First Enoch. Just a quick proviso before we jump into that, though. I have completed two videos talking a little bit, at least, about this material. And so if you haven't watched them already, it might be worth going and watching them. I'll link them in a card above. But just in case you have seen them, I will be rehashing a little bit of that material, but hopefully there'll be enough new material in this that you'll still be interested in this content as well. So let's dive straight in. Before we dive into the content, I think it's good to look at the structure of the book itself, or at least the section that we're looking at. And we'll see that structure of just the first 10 chapters of the book of First Enoch, which sort of covers the sin of the Watchers, the sin of the giants, and then after that gets into the judgment of those parties, is actually quite complex. There's actually sort of several narrative strands all running together that sort of weave this entire story. And so you'll see that there is sort of starts with the conspiracy and the deed, which is the angels plan to do this thing and then them actually doing that thing, the sin, the descending to earth and inhabiting with humanity. But then you'll see that the different ways that the outcome of that plays out is told through several different narrative portraits. You've got the teaching of the angels, you've got the birth of the giants, the desolation caused by the giants, the sin caused by the teachings, and then you've also got the response of the other angels, the other archangels, when they bring that before God. And then a lot of the material is again rehashed, but with a different perspective in mind. And so you'll see that there actually I've taken this from Nicholsberg's commentary, but you'll see there are three strands, three different sections um, covering through all of this, and you can see this in the next slide as well. That sort of comes to a head in God's response, which is sort of one narrative strand. And even though it rehashes a lot of the material, it is actually sort of dealing with, well, what do we do with this sin? What do we deal with the consequences? And how do we fix the situation? And so that's the structure of the first 10 chapters, and then I'll be diving into some of the later sections going up to chapter 15 as well. But just to give us a general idea, this is the structure we're looking at, and so we can understand the complexity of it as well. The complexity is also answered by the fact that the text that we have in front of us is largely of composite nature. Nicholsberg in his commentary goes at great lengths to show that the content of the Book of Watchers is most likely constituted from three different narrative traditions and three different manuscript traditions or redaction traditions that each have sort of their own distinct little flavor in understanding the sin of the Watchers and the prevalence of the giants, etc., etc. And then all of these are compiled, or at least Nicholsberg will suggest that they're compiled by the final redactor who put together the whole of First Enoch. And so this redactor was taking these sections of earlier Enochic tradition and compiling them into the form of the Book of Watchers that we have, and then situating the Book of Watchers in the rest of the five-part structure of the Book of First Enoch. And then adding to this as well, it's also important to know that the translations that we have are actually derived from different manuscript traditions and different sources. To name a few of them, we have the Ethiopic tradition, written in the Ge'ez language, which was for a long time really the only version of First Enoch that we had access to. And then there were certain Greek manuscripts found among some Gnostic codices, such as the Achmim Codex, which was a Gnostic codex that had sections of the Book of Watchers in it, or at least hinted at it or quoted from it. And it really wasn't until we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls that we had access to much older um, Aramaic fragments of the book. But it's important to note that most of the form that we have now is actually a composite of the Greek and the Ethiopic, with sprinklings of the Aramaic. The Aramaic fragments are actually very incomplete in their nature, and a lot of them were quite damaged. And so we don't have full Aramaic manuscripts as such, but we certainly have them to anchor the age of the text and then also to help us with certain translation issues. But you can just get from that that this is quite a complex manuscript tradition, and so therefore there is a lot of composite nature in the text itself. That being said, though, um, we don't necessarily have to treat the book as sort of a hodgepodge, as Nicolsburg might suggest. Rather, scholars like Reed and Collins would actually state that no, yes, the text is composite, but actually the redactor is aware of this and has actually deliberately woven these different traditions together in order to give the full picture and the full scope of the tradition itself. And so while there might be slight discrepancies, and Nicolsburg certainly points this out, between the different accounts, we can actually, as a reader, take each of them deliberately as woven into the final form that we have them, and actually trust that that woven, put together composite nature represents the original thought of the author and also definitely the design of the redactor, that we're meant to read it this way. We're not as such reading a pile of random text. We're meant to read it in this order and in this sort of layout. This is how the author intends us to encounter the literature. And so, even though it is of composite nature, the text is a whole and depicts the complete nature and scope of the fall of the angels. So that's just a brief sort of sidebar to start with, just to get us into the nature of the text. And we'll go from there and we'll actually start reading some of it in this next section. So we begin by reading in 1 Enoch 6, where we first read about the fallen angels. We read that when the sons of men had multiplied in those days, beautiful and comely daughters were born to them, and the watchers, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. And they said to one another, Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the daughters of men, and let us beget children for ourselves. And Shemyaza, their chief, said, I fear that you will not want to do this deed, and I alone shall be guilty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and let us all bind one another with a curse, that none of us turn back from this counsel until we fulfill it and do this deed. Then they all swore together and bound one another with a curse, and there were all of them 200 who descended in the days of Jared onto the peak of Mount Hermon. And they called the mountain Hermon because they swore and bound another with a curse on it. So already there's quite a lot of similarity here with the passages in Genesis 6, especially the notion of when men had multiplied in those days, beautiful daughters were born, and the angels saw them and desired them and took them. That's almost a word for word re-quoting of Genesis 6, 1 and 2. But what's interesting is we're added extra details here, and these details are both geographical and also temporal. So geographically, we're told that the watchers descend on Mount Hermon. And that's really important. That's not a redundant or just arbitrary mention. That's actually very important because Mount Hermon, in the biblical tradition and the biblical worldview, is already imbued with significant geographical mythology. It's a very significant place. Um, just to give an understanding, Hermon is situated in the headwaters of of Bashan in the north of Israel, and you can still go there today. But in the biblical worldview and the imagination, this region was associated with evil for a very long time. Even in the Canaanite mythology, the center of Bashan at the foot of Mount Hermon was associated with the gates of the underworld. And Bashan itself, the name, most likely stems from a Canaanite word batan, which means serpent. And we all know what that would imply in the biblical imagination. So Bashan, then by extension, Hermon as well, is the realm of the serpent. And during the period of the conquest, definitely it was inhabited by giants who are all tied in with this understanding of spiritual evil and sin. And this is a picture here from one of my own trips to Israel of Mount Hermon, and then to the top there I've got an image of Gilgal Raphaim, which is a ancient ruin, ancient structure there, translated wheel or circle of the giants, which is actually at the foot of Mount Hermon in Bashan. And near it, there is also what archaeologists are now identifying as possibly even a serpent mound, like we find in America as well. And so we have here association with serpents, we have association with giants at the foot of Mount Hermon there as well. And I've just noted here the side that the name Hermon itself is connected with the Hebrew word haram, which means to devote or to bind. So it's interesting that the angels come here to Mount Hermon, to Haram, to bind themselves together. So that's some portraits there, just a picture to give you an understanding of what we're looking at here. But I also want to show you some quotations from George Nicholsberg on understanding why Mount Hermon was viewed as such a divine place in the first place. He says the choice of place is not accidental. Literary, epigraphic, and archaeological evidence from the Bronze Age to the Roman period indicates that over a long period of time, the region around Mount Hermon was sacred to the Canaanites, Israelites, non-Israelites of the Greco-Roman period, and even Christians. None of this will surprise a visitor to the area. The mountain is an awesome, imposing presence, dominating the landscape for many miles in every direction. Its enormous peak reaches up to 2,814 meters above sea level, and at its base, four major streams converge to form the headwaters of the Jordan River. He concludes that this is the kind of geography that is universally associated with epiphanies and worship of the gods. And I'm just on that note, the idea of association with epiphanies and worship, you'll see in the Book of Enoch and other Second Temple literature that Mount Hermon is actually associated with visionary experiences, not just with the descent of the Watchers. So, first Enoch 13, just after this episode of the fallen angels, Enoch is said to be there at the foot of Mount Hermon, where he recites the memorandum of the Watcher's petition until he falls asleep, and then dreams come upon him and visions fall upon him in that state, and that's at Mount Hermon. And then in the Testament of Levi as well, the patriarch says that he is asleep, and behold, and he sees a high mountain which he is upon. And really, the only high mountain in Israel is Mount Hermon. And so many scholars associate Levi's vision with Mount Hermon as well. And it's there in this vision on the mountain that he has a vision of the heavens being opened and an angel of the Lord speaking to him. So it's no accident that Mount Hermon is mentioned here in the Enochic literature. And even into the time of Christ, there was a substantial pagan cult that had been built up in the area to a multitude of deities. And most prominent of these was Pan, actually from where the Hellenistic title of the place Barneus comes from. And Pan was a Greek deity associated with fear, terror, and also fertility. And so there was this ongoing cultic presence in this area. And it's interesting, actually, that this is the site of Christ's declaration, "On this rock I shall build my church, and the gates of hell shall not stand against it." So Jesus is even aware of this tradition when he goes here and pronounces that the gates of hell, the gates of the underworld, this place was literally known as the gates of the underworld. And so he knows what he's doing. This is very charged language. This is cosmic geography on display in the New Testament. And this is also likely the site of the Transfiguration. So while the site of the Transfiguration is debated, most early traditions associate it with the highest mountain in Israel, which of course is Mount Hermon. And so it's very fitting that Christ would reveal his true glory on this mountain, which has for so long been associated with the gods and divine experiences and epiphanies as well. And I've just got more images here of Barneus today from when I went there. You can see this is a reconstruction of what the cult center would have looked like in the days of Jesus. And then just at the bottom here, I've got an image of rock-hewn clefts that were made for idols and carved into the base of the mountain. These are permanent even today. So this place is very charged spiritually. And so it's no surprise that it's the locale for the descent of the Watchers, who, in at least the Enochic understanding, are the origin of all sin and wickedness. But it's not just the geographical location of where the angels descend that is important, but it's also the temporal factor of when they did this. And the narrative tells us that it was in the days of Jared. This is interesting because, like I said, how Hermon and Haram form a word play, the mountain and the binding on the mountain. You also see that Yarad and the fact that they descend is also a word play. Yarad means to descend in Hebrew. And so the Watchers descend in the days of descend. This is a definitive temporal marker and aligns the activities of the Watchers with the days of both Enoch and his father. Because if you remember from Genesis 5, Jared is the father of Enoch. And while these details are not really present in the biblical canon, when we read the genealogy of the Sethites, we note that this understanding of the descent of the Watchers in the days of Jared was common in other Second Temple literature. And I've listed Jubilees, 4:15, as well as the Genesis Apocryphon in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But as well as this, we also see that later rabbinical literature will point this out. And so the compilation, The Legend of the Jews, says that the depravity of mankind, which began to show itself in the time of Enoch, had increased monstrously in the time of Jared by reason of the fallen angels. Then we also see that many later Second Temple literature and early sectarian documents also have this tradition of angels descending. We see that Jubilees 5:1 says that when humanity began to multiply on the surface of the earth and daughters were born to them, the angels of the Lord saw that they were beautiful to look at, and so they married whomever they chose, and they gave birth to children, and they were giants. Pretty much word for word the same as First Enoch 6, and also Genesis 6 as well. And so Jubilees 5 is definitely borrowing from both of these traditions. And then the Damascus document among the Dead Sea Scrolls reads that the watchers of heaven fell because of this. They were taken because they did not keep the commandments of God. And their sons, as tall as cedar trees, or giants, whose bodies were like mountains, likewise fell, and all flesh on the dry land perished. They were as though they had not been, because they did their own will and did not keep the commandments of their Maker, so that his anger was kindled against them. We also see that Josephus mentions this in his Antiquities of the Jews, where he says that many angels of God accompanied with women and begot unjust sons, and he goes on to say, these are whom the Grecians called giants. And then in later Christian literature, the Sibylline Oracles, we read that these were the watchers who received this title because they had a sleepless mind in their hearts and an insatiable personality. The author is sort of hinting at the notion of them seeing the women and being insatiable and lustful in their hearts, and that's why they receive the title of a watcher, sort of some watching illegitimately. And then we'll also see that into the early Christian era, many church fathers corroborate the legend of fallen angels. Clement of Alexandria uses it as a teaching tool. He says, the angels who forsook the beauty of God for perishable beauty fell as far as heaven is from the earth. That's an image for people not to do the same thing. The same things in Nemesius of Amisa's sermons. He writes, of the incorporeal beings only angels fell away, and not all of them, but only some, that inclined to things below and set their desire on things of earth, withdrawing from their relations with things above, even from God. And so this has been used, and indeed still is used, as an image of sexual immorality, of going against the will of God. And it was a common image even to the early Christian era, the notion of fallen angels and their sin in lusting after women. The descent of the Watchers in the early section of the Book of Watchers, it's also depicted in terms of them teaching illicit knowledge to humanity. And so their fall isn't just them disobeying God and coming to earth, but actually what they did on earth. Not just sexual immorality, but also illicit teaching, teaching things that humanity shouldn't have known. And this is in the start of the next chapter, chapter 7, where we read that they took for themselves wives from among them as they chose, but they began to go into them to defile them and to teach them sorcery and charms, and to reveal to them the cutting of roots and plants. And that's expressed further and sort of expanded upon in the next chapter of chapter 8, where we read that each angel teaches his own sort of form of teaching. Azael taught them to make swords of iron and weapons and shields and breastplates and instruments of war. He showed them metals of the earth and how they should work gold to fashion it suitably, and concerning silver to fashion it for bracelets and ornaments for women. He showed them concerning antimony and eye paint and all the manner of precious stones and dyes. And the sons of men made for themselves and for their daughters, and they transgressed and led the holy ones astray. There was much ungodliness on the earth, and it happened that their ways were desolate. And then we read that Shemiaza taught spells and cuttings of roots. Homani taught the sorcery for the loosing of spells and magic and skill. Barachel taught the signs of the lightning. Kochebel the signs of the stars. Zikel the signs of the shooting stars. Artokof the signs of the earth. Shamsiel the sun. And Sariel the moon. And then we read that the cry of wickedness went up to heaven. It's interesting that each of the angels are associated almost like in a Promethean way with their function and what they teach. And so each of the angels' names mean what they teach. Barachel means lightning of God, and it's suitable then that he teaches the reading of lightning flashes. Kochbel means star of God. He teaches the reading of the stars. Harmani, from the root haram, the same root that Hermon, Mount Hermon, is built from, means to bind, and so he teaches the binding and loosing of spells. And then Shamsiel, the son of God, Sun, teaches the readings of the sun. And so this is then getting into the realm of these angels teaching specific skills and possibly then being worshipped for the skills that they taught. It's no surprise that in later sections of First Enoch, the teaching of these angels is associated with them bringing destruction on men and leading them astray to sacrifice to demons as to gods unto the great day of judgment. And here, David Jackson will argue that we might identify in the Enochic tradition here a bridge between the portraits of the false gods in the Hebrew Bible, like in Psalm 82, 106, Deuteronomy 32, and then the Enochic portrait of the Watchers here. The Watchers not only teach humanity the skills to make idols, but they also, we might argue, institute themselves as the objects of that worship. So that's really, really bad. And in my previous video on the Sons of God, I talked about how each of the things the Watchers reveal sort of fit into the three areas of sin that are expressed in the Torah. And that is violence and murder. Azael teaches them to make swords and weapons. Sexual immorality, they're taught how to make women more beautiful or men more attractive, and so then leading people down to more promiscuous lifestyles. But then also idol worship as well, because they teach them how to make and sort of craft with precious metals and fashion metals in a way that they can use them for worship objects. And then this is sort of the nail in the coffin, the final thing, that the angels then possibly also led those humans to worship them through these teachings that they gave to humanity. The final section of the teaching is associated with the petition that the archangels bring before God. And in that section, they sort of rehash everything that the Watchers have done and everything they've taught, but they have a specific judgment on it that's really important to notice. To read in 1 Enoch 9, they say, the archangels to God, "You are the God of gods and the Lord of lords and King of kings and God of the ages. You've seen what Azael has done, how he has taught all iniquity on the earth, and has revealed the eternal mysteries that are in heaven, which the Son of Man was striving to learn." And here we get the idea that Azael had taught, all of his teachings led to sin. He's taught all iniquity. But he's revealed mysteries that humanity wasn't meant to have, but they were seeking to have them. And he gave them in a way that was illicit, that was not sort of allowed by God. We read that Shemaiah has done the same, and Shemaiah is culpable because he was the one who was given authority to rule over these angels. So he has sort of fallen asleep at the wheel and allowed this to happen. And then we read that they have gone to the daughters of men, they have lain with them, they've defiled themselves with women. And then again, they've revealed to them all sin, have taught them to make hate-inducing charms, so magic. And look, the daughters of men have borne children, giants, half-breeds, and the blood of men is shed on the earth, and the whole earth is full of iniquity. And so this demands a response by God, and we'll get to that in a second. The sharing of forbidden wisdom, though, we've just been talking at length of this, is preserved in other sections of Second Temple literature. But interestingly, it's important to note that it's not always a bad thing. So sometimes this wisdom that's revealed from heaven is forbidden, and then it's a negative portrait. But sometimes it's also a positive thing, like in the case of Jubilees 4:15. That's where angels come down to teach good things among humanity, but then they're eventually led astray by humanity into teaching them bad things. And that's definitely the case in Jubilees 8, where it's definitely a negative thing, like in the book of Enoch here. But interesting, in other Jewish legends, and even in Josephus, we know that even humanity, the sons of Seth, are attributed as inventors of similar skills, particularly astronomy. They're said to be the ones of the peculiar sort of wisdom which is concerned with the heavenly bodies and their order. And we'll also note that in the priestly account of Genesis 1 to 11, Cain and his descendants are labeled as those who are bringers forth of culture, or the culture heroes of the day. And the reason I've translated that sort of clumsy bringers forth or forth bringers is because the Hebrew root of the Cain's descendants, Jubal, Jabal, and Tubal, all comes from the Hebrew root yabal, which means to bring forth something. And so it's very deliberate that Cain's descendants are associated with this revelation as well. But within the Enochic literature, there are sort of two distinct portraits. There's the good wisdom and then the bad wisdom, and often they're pitted against each other, depending on the motive of which wisdom is associated with. So in Jubilees, as I mentioned before, we'll see that the patriarchs Enoch and Noah are given a counter revelation from the holy angels in order to help with the sin of the watchers. So Enoch, in his dream visions, is given the heavenly wisdom of astronomy by which to institute the true calendar, as well as oneiromancy, or the interpretation of dreams, by which he can warn the righteous of the coming judgment. And then Noah is also taught medicine and healing in order to counteract the spread of disease and sickness at the hands of demons after the flood in Jubilees 10. And one may also see a reversal of the techne, or the technology revealed by the watchers, in God sending the archangel Sariel to teach the righteous one, Noah, to build the ark in order to escape the flood. We'll talk a little bit more about Sariel a bit later. And so there's definitely a positive image of wisdom in these sections, sort of meant to counteract the negative wisdom. But it's definitely the wisdom revealed by the Watchers is 100% a negative portrait. In fact, in later chapters, God will even declare their teaching as worthless teaching, as in their wisdom is incomparable to the mysteries of wisdom that God will reveal to his chosen ones, who he chooses to reveal it to. In Enoch 16:3 we read, "You are in heaven, and no mystery was revealed to you, but a stolen mystery you learned. And this you made known to the women in your hardness of heart. And through this mystery the women and men are multiplying evils on the earth." And this idea of multiplying evils, multiplying violence, leads us to our next discussion, that the negative portrait of the teachings is very much associated with the spread of wickedness. Through these teachings, wickedness has been spread across creation. And this is even in Genesis 6, where we read in verse 5 that the thoughts of humanity were only evil all the time. And this is because, at least in the Enochic understanding, because of the teaching of the Watchers. We can see this in rabbinic literature as well as other Second Temple literature. So the Genesis Rabbah, commenting on Genesis 6:1-4, and especially verse 5, says, "The earth had become filled with Hamas, violence, through them," the Watchers. Rabbi Levi said Hamas refers to idolatry, sexual immorality, and murder. And if you remember, those are the three sort of categories that the Watchers teach. They teach the means for idolatry, the means for murder and warfare, and the means for sexual immorality. And then 2 Enoch 34 will say that all the world will sin by injustices, crimes, and idolatries, and adulteries. Again, those threefold things. And this is what brings upon the flood. And this is why God sends the flood upon the earth. Now that we've dealt with the story of the Watchers and their fall and their sin and their teachings, the next sort of thing that we need to talk about when we're looking at the Book of Watchers is, of course, the giants and the spread of further violence and wickedness upon the earth because of them. And so we'll read in 1 Enoch 7 that these and all the others with them took themselves wives from among them as they chose, that's the Watchers, and they went and defiled themselves through them. And the women conceived and bore to them great giants. The giants begot Nephilim, the Nephilim begot Eliud, and they were growing in accordance with their greatness. Eliud there is often not understood by scholars. We're not sure what the word means. At least in my understanding, my suggestion might be that it's related to the word for a tall palm tree, and so it's therefore, or possibly even the Hebrew word aliyah, which means to go up, and so it could refer to the tall or just a big giant. It's not really clear what the text is saying here, but in any case, the giants are begetting bigger giants and bigger giants, and it's just getting worse and worse in each generation. We read next that they were devouring the labor of all of humanity, and men were not able to supply them, and the giants began to kill men and devour them. They began to sin against the birds and the beasts and the creeping things and the fish. They devoured one another's flesh, and then, to make matters worse, they drank the blood, which is a big no-no in the Torah. Drinking the blood is drinking the life of something. So this is almost vampiric in a way. And then we read that the earth brought accusation against the lawless ones, which is unsurprising. So this is the full portrait of the sin of the giants, which is even more just worse than the sin of the watchers. And so you can really understand why in the Enochic worldview, these two portraits, the watchers and the giants, are really the cause of sin on the earth. It's very, very dire situation for creation. Um, Now, when it comes to the biblical understanding of giants, there are a little bit of confusion regarding what the words Nephilim and Gibborim mean, but I won't go into that completely here because I've talked about that in a previous video. We can see, at least in the biblical literature, this biblical extra biblical literature such as First Enoch and Jubilees, as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the Nephilim, the giants, are understood as the offspring between heaven and earth. So they're hybrid creatures, offspring of the watchers and women, and they spread evil and violence before the flood with their violent actions and their warfare. And so this then leads to the eventual judgment, which results in their physical forms being destroyed, and then their disembodied souls remaining as evil spirits on the earth after the flood, which we'll get to at the end. The Book of Giants, interestingly also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, depicts the giants in this same way as the violent offspring of the corrupt angels. But it's also apparent there that there's connections with ancient Near Eastern mythology, interestingly, because some of the names of the giants relate to ancient Near Eastern, especially Neo-Babylonian mythology, such as Gilgamesh and Humbaba, who are both characters in the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh. Within the Enochic portrait, though, the main issue with the giants is not as such their violence, even though that is a large part of their role in the narrative, but more so the fact that they are of hybrid nature. And that's really what's highlighted in the later sections of First Enoch, which deals with the judgment of the giants. Their hybrid nature, being born of both heaven and earth, is what causes them to be such an issue, especially in the post-flood world. So we read in First Enoch 15, from verse 8, that the giants who were begotten by the spirits and flesh will be called evil spirits on the earth. The spirits that have gone forth from their body are evil spirits, and for from humans they came, and from the holy watchers was their origin. Evil spirits they will be on the earth, and evil spirits they will be called. The spirits of heaven on heaven is their dwelling place, but the spirits of earth on earth is their dwelling. The spirits of the giants lead astray, do violence, make desolate, attack, wrestle, hurl upon the earth, and cause illness. They eat nothing but abstain from food and are thirsty and smite. The spirits will rise up against the sons of men and against women, for they have come forth from them. And you see here that, just pause for a second, the giants, what they do in their disembodied state is exactly what they had done in their embodied state. They actually are starved and they're thirsty, and because of that they smite. So while in their life they had been gluttonous and eaten to extent, so much that they ate people as well, they're now starved of that, but they're so driven by that hunger that they attack human beings. They cause all sorts of sickness as well, and they attack people and do violence. And so this is really the beginning of the demonic realm as far as the Enochic understanding is concerned. We read from the day of the slaughter and destruction and death of the giants, which is in the flood. From the soul of whose flesh the spirits are proceeding, they are making desolate without incurring judgment. And thus they will make desolate until the day of the consummation of judgment, when the great age will be consummated all at once. And so you get this idea that God will allow them to do this as a form of judgment on humanity after the flood. And they will not incur judgment in that time period, but judgment will come and there will be deliverance from these demonic spirits promised. The Book of Jubilees gives pretty much a parallel portrait to this, and it does so through the portrait of Noah, who brings a petition before God about these spirits. Noah says, "You know how your watchers, the fathers of these spirits, have acted during my lifetime. As for these spirits who have remained alive, shut them up and hold them captive in the place of judgment. May they not cause destruction among your servants' sons, my God, for they are depraved and were created for the purpose of destroying." There we read also that Mastema, who is basically means wickedness, is another name for Satan, the leader of the spirits, comes and he petitions on behalf of God as well as Noah and says, "Lord, leave some of them before me, let them listen to me and do everything that I tell them, because if none of them is left for me, I shall not be able to exercise the authority of my will among humanity." the authority of my will being to punish them and to judge them until the great judgment. He says that for the evil of humanity is great, and so I will need them for the purpose of destroying and misleading them before my punishment. So even Satan here is understanding of his future punishment. And so he needs to enlist these demonic spirits in order to use them for his own purposes. And then he asks God to leave a tenth for him and then imprison 9 parts in the abyss. And of all the evil ones who are depraved, the archangels imprisoned in the place of judgment. And like God said, they left a tenth to exercise power on the earth before Satan. So God does so. He allows Mastema or Satan to have a tenth of them and he imprisons the rest. And then humanity is meant to sort of deal with this after the flood. But as I mentioned earlier, Noah is given a counter revelation at this point by the archangel Raphael, the healer of God, and instructed how to heal the demonic maladies with herbal remedies and medicine, and then also with spiritual exorcisms as well, which constitutes the traditions of Noah, or the Book of Noah, which we mentioned in, I believe, our second session of this discussion. It's interesting then that Enochic literature sheds more light on the fate of these figures post-flood, because it's not really a thing that's in mind in the biblical literature. But it's interesting that the Enochic corpus deliberately connects them with evil spirits that rule over the earth and torment humanity after the flood. And so in this form, this is picked up by other Second Temple literature like Jubilees, but also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which will call them bastard spirits, illegitimate spirits because of their hybrid nature, but also evil spirits and spirits of the giants in Jubilees, and also spirits of the earth because they're born on the earth, as we just read. You can see this in this exorcism that is found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which says, proclaim his glorious wonders so as to frighten and terrify all the spirits of the destroying angels, the bastard spirits, the demons, the Lilith, the howlers, the desert dwellers, those who fall upon men without warning to lead them astray from a spirit of understanding, to make their heart desolate during the present dominion of wickedness. And so this understanding in the Enochic worldview is what influenced the Qumran community and their understanding of the spiritual world and spiritual warfare, and it even featured into their exorcisms, which is a fascinating detail. The connection also between the violence and sin revealed by the Watchers, and then also this violence of the giants, is actually drawn out, I think, quite brilliantly by David Jackson, where he'll note that the Hebrew word for demon or spirit, which is shed, seems to be connected with the Hebrew word shedad, which means violence or ruin. So there's no mistake then that shades, demons, were associated with shedad, with violence, the spirits of the giants, with the violence after the flood. He says that this may account for the distinctive connection in the Enochic tradition between the demons and spirits of the dead giants and their violence. This connection is emphasized in the mode of execution chosen for the giants, whereby they kill each other. That's something that we'll see at the end of the video when we talk about the judgment of the archangels. And I've quoted this before, but I'll quote it again here just because it fits with our dealings of the giants here. George Nicholsberg will summarize the fate of the giants by saying that the giants' death is the prelude and presupposition for the continued violent and disastrous activity of their spirits. Their death being by violence. They kill each other and then they're also wiped out in the flood. And this is a prelude to their actions after the flood, which goes on unpunished until the final judgment. The consequences of the Watchers' sin are in keeping with the author's understanding of the nature of sin. Since the Watchers are heavenly, spiritual, and immortal, the divine spirit with which they have endowed their sons is eradicable in the normal sense. They can't die, they're immortal, at least spiritually. The death of their human side serves only to free the spirit for further activity. Moreover, as one can see from their activities, the giants have inherited the wicked, rebellious side of their father's nature. He says the freed spirits of the dead giants then constitute the demonic realm that carries on the activities for which the giants were judged and punished according to 1 Enoch 6:11. The giants and the spirits that proceed from their bodies are spoken of as the same entities. The Watcher's willful confusion of the created order has had its inevitable results, their confusion of boundaries, because they've joined heaven and earth. Because of the dual nature of the giants, the body of their flesh can die, but on the other hand, their spirits have a continued existence because they were begotten on earth. They must remain on earth as demons, and here they constitute an empire of evil spirits who wreak all manner of havoc on the human race. And this is really the deeply felt consequences of the actions of the Watchers. This is probably more made acutely aware in the Second Temple period, more so than the illicit teachings, than our understanding of demonic possession and infiltration into the world. And this is definitely something that we see even in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, with this high focus on Christ casting out demonic activity. This is the repercussions of the Watchers. We have the Watchers to thank for this, and their sin to thank for this, at least as far as the Enochic worldview is concerned. We see that this is carried forward in later Christian literature, where the spirits of the giants are associated, interestingly, with the Greek Titans. And this is possibly a product of Second Temple period and Hellenization, but this interpretation calls them ancient phantoms who were destroyed by the flood, which is definitely the Enochic portrait. So in the Sibylline oracles, this is the great last judgment. It says that the angel Uriel will break the gigantic bonds of unyielding and unbreakable steel of the gates of Hades, and he will throw them wide open and lead all the mournful forms to judgment, especially those of the ancient phantoms, the titans and the giants that the flood destroyed. So the understanding of the flood and the giants, as here, even in view on the final judgment, these ancient phantoms are especially the ones that will finally incur judgment because they've existed for so long without incurring judgment. It's interesting, actually, just a side note, I've got a little point at the bottom here, that they are associated with titans because there are only sort of one or two instances in the Old Testament, especially in the Greek translation, where the Hebrew words either Nephilim or Rephaim are actually translated by the Greek Titan or Titan. And that's only in 2 Kingdoms 5:18 and 22. It's the only time it's used. But here, clearly, the Greek author has in mind the Titans, the great primordial giants from before the flood in Greek mythology, and associates them with the Nephilim, or the giants of the Book of Watchers, who were also primordial beings from before the flood. Finally, to wrap up our discussion on this section of the Book of Watchers, we need to deal with the judgment of God and the archangels. And that's something I've hinted at throughout, especially dealing with the judgment of the giants. But I think here it might be good to walk through each of the portraits of how God sends each one of the archangels to fulfill his judgment on a different aspect of the sin of the Watchers. So we will begin by the Most High sending Sariel to the son of Lamech, that is Noah, and he says, "Go to Noah and say to him in my name, hide yourself. Reveal to him that the end is coming, that the whole earth will perish. Tell him that a deluge is about to come upon the whole world and destroy everything on the earth. Teach the righteous one what he should do, the son of Lamech how he may preserve himself alive and escape forever. From him a plant will be planted, and his seed will endure for all the generations of eternity." And here we get this idea that God is going to send an angel to teach Noah how to build an ark in order to escape the flood. And this idea of Noah being a plant that is planted, and this idea of a seed to endure for all generations, is the idea that through Noah, the promised line, the chosen seed, will endure, even though the rest of humanity has been tainted by the sin of the Watchers and also by the violence of the giants. So this aspect of saving the righteous remnant is sort of the first thing that God gets accomplished before he goes about pronouncing judgment on the Watchers. It's Raphael, interestingly, whose name means God heals, who is sent to bind Azael, who's sort of the instigator of all this wickedness. He's sent to bind him hand and foot and cast him into darkness. Make an opening in the wilderness that is in Dudael. Throw him there and lay beneath him sharp and jagged stones and cover him with darkness. Let him dwell there for an exceedingly long time. Cover his face and let him not see the light. And on the day of the great judgment he will be led away to the burning conflagration and heal the earth, which the Watchers have desolated, and announce the healing of the earth. So at first we're confused as to why Raphael is sent to bind Azael. It seems like something more like Gabriel or Michael might do as the warriors of God. But nevertheless, at the end of the section, we're reminded that Raphael, who brings the healing of the world, the healing of God, is commanded to heal the earth, which the Watchers have desolated in their sin and their violence, and especially the wickedness of the giants. And then Raphael is meant to herald the healing of the earth. That's quite fitting with his name. As far as the binding of Azael goes, though, it's interesting the notes that are made here that he is bound in the desert, in the wilderness, in a pit of jagged stones. And this reminds us, at least a keen reader, of the tradition of the Azazel, or the goat for Azazel, which is sort of understood as a dark desert-dwelling entity in the Torah. And the connection here is already very clear in the Ge'ez manuscripts, because the Ge'ez, or the Ethiopic language, translates Azael from the Greek into Azazel, making this direct connection with Leviticus 16. But this figure features in the Levitical practices on Yom Kippur, where a sacrificial goat is selected and led into the wilderness for Azazel. We read in Leviticus 16, 8-10 that one goat is for Yahweh and one goat is for Azazel. And it's confusing as to what this word means. Some people just translate it as the wilderness or the pit of the wilderness, but it's definitely a demonic entity, I think, because the root of the word Azazel means the strong God. And so there's clearly some form of spiritual entity in mind here, a strong spiritual force. What's more, though, Azazel is also associated in Leviticus 17 and also in 2 Chronicles 11 and Isaiah 34 with the She'erim figures, who are kind of enigmatic spiritual entities, which are sometimes rendered as goat demons or goat idols. And so the association with Azazel and goats, and then with goat demons, sort of wraps us all up together, sort of strengthening the link between the very negative fallen angel portrait of the book of Enoch in Azael and then other demonic entities in the Bible. So that's an interesting point as well with this judgment on Azazel and how much it relates to this Torah tradition that it probably is deriving the name from. Next, we see that Gabriel, whose name means mighty man of God or warrior of God, Gibor El, he is sent to the bastards, the half-breeds, the sons of miscegenation, the giants, and he is sent to destroy the sons of the Watchers from among the sons of men, and to send them against one another in a war of destruction. So we mentioned earlier that their judgment is quite fitting their action. So they had spread violence and wickedness and warfare on the earth, and this is how they wiped out. They wipe out each other by killing each other through their violence. And it's fitting that the mighty warrior of God, Gabriel, is the one sent to instigate this war. The mighty angel who goes and instigates the war of the giants and eventually leads to the giants killing themselves and then also being wiped out in the flood. And then finally, Michael is sent, and Michael has a very long passage where he's sent to bind the rest of the angels. So Azael's been dealt with, the giants have been dealt with, and now the rest of the angels have to be dealt with, and they are chucked into the pit and bound there for for several thousand years, pretty much. 70 generations is a long time in the biblical understanding until the day of judgment. The day of judgment, everlasting judgment, is consummated, and they are made to watch the defeat of their children. And they're made to watch their children kill each other, which is pretty metal, pretty full on. And then they're imprisoned pretty much forever in the pit. They're led away to the fiery abyss, to the torture, and to the prison where they'll be confined forever. And then, interestingly, a final note, everyone who is condemned and destroyed henceforth will be bound together with them until the end of the generation. So that's interesting. So Michael is sent to bind the Watchers, which is definitely on view in like passages of Jude 6 and 2 Peter 2:4, where we have angels that are chained in Tartarus and in darkness and awaiting the judgment. But it's also worth noting that at the end, whoever is condemned and destroyed henceforth will be bound with them. So you get the idea of the wicked and the fallen angels being bound together. And this is something that's hinted at very heavily in the New Testament. Like Jesus himself will say in Matthew 25:41, "Depart from me, you accursed ones, into the eternal fire that has been prepared for the devil and his angels." And then also in Revelation 20, we see that the devil, who deceived the world, is thrown into the lake of fire along with the beast and the false prophet, where they're tormented forever. And then finally, anyone who's not written in the Lamb's book of life is also thrown into the fire with them. The section of the judgments of God then comes to an end with this final Edenic vision, where Michael is sent to renovate the earth and restore it back to the original goodness that God had initially bestowed on it when he created it before the fall of the angels. It's interesting though because it's unclear as to when this is meant to be fulfilled. Because in the narrative it seems that this is restored after the flood. But it seems to be ill-fitted here because obviously even in the biblical account, human sin is not dealt with Certainly in the Enochic portrait, demons are still a thing and causing affliction, and even in the other Second Temple literature, when Noah and his sons get off the ark, the world is still very much broken and isn't restored to this original goodness. And so that then leaves us, especially with the apocalyptic viewpoint of the book of First Enoch, that this is a final vision of the new creation that will be restored after the final sort of cosmic flood in the final judgment, which will deal with the demons finally, will cast the angels into the lake of fire, and will bring about a restored creation for humanity. So we read, then all the earth will be tilled in righteousness, and all of it will be planted with trees and filled with blessing, and all the sons of men will become righteous. They will no longer be tainted by the wickedness of angels and giants. All the peoples will worship me and will bless me and prostrate themselves, and no longer be worshipping fallen angels who taught them skills of culture, no doubt. Then we read, I shall open the storehouse of blessing that are in heaven and make them descend on the earth upon the works and the labor of the sons of men. And this is something that was hinted at even at the beginning in Enoch's dream visions and his prophetic utterances before the narrative of the Watchers proper, that there would be a judgment of the wicked, but an ongoing blessing for the righteous if they follow God's ways. And here, this is sort of brought again to the forefront of the reader in the restoration of creation after the destruction of the angels and the giants. And then it concludes, truth and peace will be united together for all the days of eternity, for all the generations of humanity. So effectively, and then they all lived happily ever after, is how this section of the Book of Watches finishes. So we'll leave it there. That's the end of this session. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.